Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Can I begin by welcoming you very warmly to this evening's inaugural lecture. It's good to see in the audience both academic colleagues and students and representatives of the local community as well. And that's the purpose of inaugural lectures, is to draw together those very diverse groups who participate in the sort of academic debate that Keele has. Obviously, the purpose of an inaugural lecture is both to show off the new professor's area of expertise, but also to give some demonstration of the cutting-edge research which is taking place within Keele, and in this case within the School of Law. It's a real pleasure to welcome this evening Tom Obokata as our new professor. Tom is very much a sort of international scholar in terms of his own personal career. He graduated in international relations from the University of Southern California. He's worked in the Republic of Korea and in Japan. He has his PhD from the UK, and obviously he's worked both in Scotland and in Northern Ireland as well, so truly an international globetrotter as part of his career. Tom joined us from Queen's University in Belfast, where he was a senior lecturer, and we're delighted to welcome him to the staff here. Tom Obokata is an expert on transnational organised crime generally, and on the trafficking of human beings in particular, a very emotive subject and one which of course has high profile in the media at the moment. He's a number of publications in these areas, the most recent one being Transnational Organised Crime in International Law, published in 2010. And he currently serves as the advisor to the Northern Ireland Assembly All-Party Group on Human Trafficking, and previously provided expert advice to bodies such as the UK Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights and the International Organisation for Migration and the European Union. In tonight's lecture, Tom will identify core obligations relating to the trafficking of human beings as established under international law, and he'll then go on to provide an analysis of the extent to which these are implemented in the United Kingdom. So, can I formally welcome Tom Obokata, our Professor of International Law and Human Rights, and invite him to present his inaugural lecture, International Law on Human Trafficking. Tom.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Good. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking Vice Chancellor Professor Foskett for that, first of all, kind introduction to this lecture, and also hosting this evening. I was very happy to be here and be able to talk about the subject that I'm really passionate about. And I also would like to thank the School of Law for its continuing support. And I'm very lucky to be surrounded by wonderful colleagues and who made my transition quite an easy one. And finally, I'd like to thank everyone in this room for taking time to be here and listen to my lecture. And I hope you find this quite interesting. If I could single out just one person, I just wanted to particularly thank my dear friend, Professor Bryce Dixon from Queen's University. I mean, he's just flown all the way from Belfast today just to be for this lecture, and I very much appreciate your support and presence. So thank you very much for that. And I do, to the rest of you, I hope that you enjoy my lecture. Now, a title, as noted, is International Law on Human Trafficking. And this is the brief outline of my lecture this evening. I would like to begin by describing what trafficking is in looking at the international definition. I then will identify relevant branches of international law as well as core obligations imposed by them. And finally, I would like to provide an analysis as to the extent to which these core obligations are implemented in this country. But before that, I just wanted to start by giving you an overview of the nature and extent of this problem. Now, according to the United States government, approximately 800,000 people are trafficked globally each year. And out of that, just in 2011, a little over 40,000 victims were identified worldwide. Now, a point to note here is that it is only about 5% of the victims are identified, meaning that the vast majority of them remain undiscovered and continue to be exploited. The annual profit to be made from trafficking amounts to approximately 31 billion US dollars. So you can understand how lucrative this business is. And according to the European Union, then about 250,000 people enter into the EU territories, including the UK, illegally. Obviously, not everyone is trafficked, but it was facilitated. Illegal entry is normally facilitated by traffickers and smugglers. And finally, in 2011, according to the UK Human Trafficking Centre, little over 2,000 victims were identified in this country. Now, the clandestine nature of this problem makes it difficult to come up with an accurate statistics, obviously, but hopefully these figures will give you some indication as to the nature and extent of this problem. So, who are the victims and where do they come from? Well, the majority of victims are women and children, about 80% women and 50% children. And age range is quite young as well, somewhere between 18 and 24. Why is that? Because women and children are easy to influence and exploit. And this is the reason why traffickers do target them more than, for example, adult men. The countries of origin, many of the victims do come from the poorer regions of the world and move to a wealthy countries such as the UK and Western Europe and the United States as well. So here we are talking about Central, Eastern, and South Europe, such as Russia, Moldova, and Ukraine, Far East, including China, Thailand, and Vietnam, and Western and Central African region, country including Nigeria. But the shocking reality also is that UK nationals here are also trafficked internally from a remote region to a big cities like Birmingham and London, and also externally. Some of them are used, for example, exploited in the red light district in Amsterdam, working in a sex industry, and so on. And particularly vulnerable are young people at risk, and that actually happens. So this is not just a problem coming from foreign countries, but it is very much a problem here as well. So who are the traffickers then, the profiles of traffickers? 52% are men, and 42, close to half are women, and 6% are carried out by both men and women. And this is an important point to note here. Women are also involved in trafficking. Why? Once again, children tend to trust them more than male traffickers. And that also happens to the women victims. They tend to trust their female colleagues, not colleagues, but female individuals over men. So this is the reason why women are actively involved in this business. Now, 54% of traffickers are known to the victims, but again, about half of them are known. These traffickers do belong to organized criminal groups or gangs such as Chinese snakehead, Japanese yakuza, also Eastern European Albanian mafias. But some also act individually. So trafficking business is, for example, carried out by families, friends, and relatives. And this particularly makes it so difficult because the victims know that they are actually being exploited by someone they know and even love. Imagine that. And that is quite difficult and makes the victimization greater. So why are these people trafficked in the first place? Now, there are a wide variety of reasons for this, but I just listed a few key reasons for the purpose of my lecture. First and foremost, poverty and economic hardships are a key reasons why people decide to migrate, because they are not able to sustain themselves economically. Women are particularly vulnerable in this regard because in many parts of the world, they are not able to enjoy the same status or rights as men. In humanitarian crises, such as war and persecution by their own government, is another reason, and as well as natural disasters. Now, do you remember tsunami 2004 on the Boxing Day that hit the Southeast Asian countries? Now, unfortunate reality of that is that traffickers did go in and start selling separated children to the rest of the world. It is that shocking, and people do take advantage. Why? Because you can make money, a huge amount of profit out of this business. The third point, discrimination against particular groups such as women and ethnic minorities. Once again, they are not able to enjoy the same rights and status as the dominant groups, and therefore they have no choice but to migrate, leave their own homes, communities, and even countries. And finally, in destination, demand for trafficked people is a very important factor. Now, I would like you to ask yourselves, why are foreign women working as prostitutes in this country? That is because there are men who are willing to pay for their services. Why are other victims exploited in agriculture, construction, and you name it, garment industry, shellfish industries? Why? Because there are employers who want to benefit from cheap labor. More importantly, there are customers who keep wanting cheap goods and products made by these trafficked victims. So the harsh reality, ladies and gentlemen, is that we as consumers are equally responsible for facilitating this crime, indirectly. So the key question then is, what can we do about it to alleviate this problem? Now, I would like to come back to that question towards the end of my lecture. But for now, I would like to move on to talk about the definition of human trafficking. Now, it has been extremely difficult to come up with a single uniform definition of trafficking to be used by all countries. Why? Because the understanding of human trafficking varied among all countries due to political, social, and cultural differences. And this inevitably has made it difficult to seek international cooperation. So the international community saw the need to do something about this and decided to adopt an international treaty known as the Protocol to Prevent, Suppress, and Punish Trafficking in Persons, attached to the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime back in 2000. As of February 2013, about 124 states or countries are parties to this treaty. Now, there are about little over 190 countries in the world. So you can see that there's a long way to go. There are other countries which are not even part of this treaty regime, and that is a cause of concern. In any event, Article 3 of this instrument or treaty provides the following definition of trafficking. Now, as you can see, this is quite long, and I am not going in detail about every single element. So what I wanted to do instead is to identify 3 key elements in this definition. The first element is the action element, that is to say, recruitment, transfer, harboring, or receipt of people. So as in any other forms of trafficking, human trafficking is about moving people from one place to another. But that is done with the second means element there, with the use of coercion, deception, abuse of power, position of vulnerability, giving and receiving payments. So trafficking is not a voluntary migration, unlike any other forms of migration such as smuggling. They are coerced, for example, abducted and sold elsewhere, or they are deceived. So what normally happens is in countries of origin, the traffickers place an advert saying there are lucrative jobs waiting for you in Western Europe. So then once they arrive in a country like this, they discover that they are being forced to work as prostitutes in Soho. So that's the element of this deception there. And final element then is the purpose element. These people were trafficked for the purpose of sexual or labor exploitation. So what happens then is traffickers have a clear intention to exploit these victims once they arrive at their destination, or have a foreknowledge that they will be exploited by others. Now, this last element of sexual and labor exploitation is worth expanding so that you have a better understanding of what happens to these victims once they arrive here. Now, sexual exploitation, the most common one would be prostitution. But there are other venues such as lap dancing or strip clubs, and pornography. Concern nowadays is child and extreme pornography, where victims are actually treated in a derogatory manners in that type of media. The statistics suggest that 43% of all victims are exploited sexually, of whom, understandably, 98% are women and girls. The second element is labor exploitation, and I'm giving you some examples of this. Domestic work, working as servants, working in garment industry, shellfish industry, catering, agriculture, and construction. But there are other forms of exploitation. You may find that quite shocking. First is begging. Now, has anyone seen this movie called Slumdog Millionaire, an Oscar-winning film by Danny Boyle? Now, do you remember a scene where two criminals are actually blinding these young Indian boys and children and force them to work as beggars? Do you remember that particular scene? Yeah? That unfortunately is not a myth or fiction, that is a reality, which happens to many children in the world. Begging and benefit fraud, and these is particularly children or people with disabilities, physical and mental disability, are trafficked in this country so that people here can claim child disability benefit. Do you find that shocking? I find that quite shocking. But there was a major news a couple of years ago about Polish. Again, there's nothing against the particular nationality, but this is in public domain. Polish traffickers actually trafficked a large number of people with mental and physical disabilities, so that people here can actually claim these benefits. And finally, drug production. I don't know if you read the Sunday Times. Just yesterday, there was an article about Vietnamese boys being trafficked into this country to work in cannabis farms. There are over 7,000 cannabis farms in England and Wales alone, and that perhaps gives you an idea as to how many people are being exploited in that kind of criminal activities, such as drug production. And the unfortunate thing is that many of these Vietnamese boys were actually prosecuted for producing drugs, and they went to jail, despite the fact that they are the victims of forced labor and slavery. And there is something wrong in that picture. I think so, and I hope you think so as well. So hopefully this will give you an idea as to what happens to these people in many cases. And now I'd like to move on to talk about relevant branches of international law dealing particularly with this issue. Now, there are mainly three branches of international law, and first of which is known as international criminal law, which aims to facilitate direct control of crimes at the international level through prosecution and punishment before an international criminal tribunal. This branch of international law saw a rapid development, particularly after World War II, when the Nazi war criminals were prosecuted and punished by the International Military Tribunal. And the most recent example of this is the Rome Statute of International Criminal Court, 1998, and Article 7 of this treaty provides for the crimes against humanity, which include enslavement and trafficking. But one of the key issues or problems here is that prosecution is not really practical before the International Criminal Court due to a large number of traffickers, and victims. And because the International Criminal Court has to deal with other serious crimes such as genocide and war crimes, it simply does not have the capacity, resources, and time to be dealing with it. So the next branch of international law becomes particularly important, which is known as transnational criminal law. Now, unlike international criminal law, it tries or facilitates indirect control of crimes at the national level through domestic penal law. So it obliges every country to enact legislation, prosecute, and punish trafficking at that level. The aforementioned Trafficking Protocol is a prime example of this branch of law. But in addition to domestic action, the protocol also aims to facilitate international cooperation. Now, this makes sense because of the transnational nature of trafficking. Makes it inevitable that all countries cooperate to prosecute and punish. So it is a very good instrument for that, but the only problem, though, is that it lacks a human rights perspective, particularly from the victim's point of view. It does not contain sufficient provisions for their protection, for example. So I have argued elsewhere that the third branch of international law becomes quite important, and that is human rights law. Now, this branch of international law is quite useful because it allows us to treat human trafficking not only as a crime, but also as a gross violation of the human rights of victims. So their protection becomes as important as the prosecution and punishment of traffickers. Now, I just wanted to mention a few instruments on this. The first one, many of you probably have heard, European Convention on Human Rights, which, as you might know, is now a part of our domestic legal system through the Human Rights Act 1998. And Article 4 of this instrument provides for the prohibition of forced labor and slavery. Another one, is more recent one, is quite important because it is an international treaty specifically on human trafficking adopted by the Council of Europe, the same entity which also adopted the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, many activists and scholars and so on agree that this is a more human rights friendly instrument because it has extensive provisions on victim protection. So these are the three key branches of international law, and now I would like to proceed with an identification of key obligations. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, I would like to focus on three obligations, and also known as 3P obligations among activists and scholars and so on, and that is firstly to prosecute and punish traffickers or trafficking, to protect victims, and finally, to prevent the practice. And I will explore and explain every single one of these obligations. Starting with an obligation to prosecute and punish. One of the obvious measures to be taken by every country is to enact legislation on trafficking and slavery. By far, the majority of the countries, whether or not they are party to the Trafficking Protocol, have done this. So this is a very important first step forward. But the next point I wanted to raise there is the facilitation of intelligence-led law enforcement through the use of special investigative techniques such as surveillance and undercover operations. Now, these measures are necessary for the law enforcement authorities to get ahead of their criminals because organized criminals nowadays are very sophisticated. They know exactly what to expect. So in order to get ahead, we have to be able to prevent them from before an actual crime is committed, as opposed to a traditional reactive law enforcement where they take action after a crime is committed. Obviously, that is not good enough because victims are already exploited. We want to prevent that. The third point then is an establishment of extraterritorial criminal jurisdiction. Now, it is a fundamental principle of international law that the state has a jurisdiction over its own territory based on the principle of state sovereignty. Now, so if the trafficking happens, for example, in the UK is primarily responsible for prosecuting and punishing. But the transnational nature of trafficking means that sometimes these acts are committed by UK nationals, for example, abroad. And what happens then? And if you do not have enough appropriate legislation, the UK government cannot prosecute and punish these UK nationals who exploit other people abroad. So there is a need to recognize this extraterritorial application of criminal law. The fourth point is mutual legal assistance in criminal matters. Measures under this heading include, for example, surrender of suspects through an extradition procedure or European arrest warrant, which has recently grabbed the attention of the general public with the likes of Julian Assange and so on. That is an instrument in place within European Union. There are other things such as transfer of evidence and also conducting joint investigations because of the transnational nature of this crime. These measures are things are quite necessary. And finally, under this heading, an effective punishment regime. Now, it is not simply enough to enact legislation. It also has to provide an effective punishment, imprisonment, so that we can deter these criminals from committing trafficking again in the future. So that is an obligation to prosecute and punish. And now I would like to explain the second obligation, to protect victims. This is particularly important, as I said, from the human rights perspective. And first and foremost, every country have to be able to identify victims properly. As I said, only about 5% of the victims are identified. And again, there's something wrong in that picture because the vast majority of them are not discovered. So there has to be an effective mechanisms in place for that purpose. Once they are identified by appropriate authorities, such as the Immigration, UK Border Agency, and the police, and they have to provide, for example, medical and psychological assistance, subsistence, and shelters, because they have been victimized in this country. And it is right that they are able to benefit from these measures. The third one, the temporary residence permits, is also a necessary measure. For example, it is necessary for them, the victims, to recover from their victimization and also to be able to cooperate with the law enforcement authorities to prosecute and punish. If they are sent back to their own country, it becomes extremely difficult to obtain evidence and testimony. That's why it is important that they are able to stay here and fully cooperate. And in the meantime, their human rights must be protected. And finally, compensation. Again, they are victims of crimes, and it is right that they are compensated. We do already have a system in this country, victim compensation scheme, that applies to victims of general crimes, and that should also be applicable to trafficking victims. Right, and then final obligation to prevent trafficking. Now, this is linked to the first obligation on prosecution and punishment because these measures will inevitably help prevent traffickers from engaging in this business again. But there are other dimensions, for example, addressing the causes of trafficking, so-called push factors in states or countries of origin, poverty, discrimination, and humanitarian crisis, and also a pull factor in destination, particularly demand for trafficked people. Another dimension to this is education and awareness raising among the general public, because we are all consumers of cheap goods and services. And that, again, is facilitating this particular crime. So we have to educate the general public more. So these are the key obligations established under international law. And now I'd like to move on to analyze the extent to which these obligations are implemented in practice in this country. Now, in relation to first obligation, prosecution and punishment, the UK government has enacted a few statutes and laws and trafficking for sexual and labor exploitation, most notably Sexual Offences Act 2003 and Asylum and Immigration Act 2004, which provides for which prohibit trafficking for sexual and labor exploitation. These two statutes also provide for extraterritorial jurisdiction. Therefore, the UK authorities are now able to prosecute and punish UK nationals who engage in trafficking, for example, in Thailand and so on. Now, the maximum punishment for this is 14 years imprisonment. Now, I can tell you that this is quite good. It's substantially longer than other European counterparts because some of the countries, the punishment range from, for example, 5 years to 10. So it is substantially longer. In relation to slavery and forced labor, there's another piece of legislation, Coroners and Justice Act, once again, which prohibits these practices and so also provides for 14 years imprisonment. So you may say that the legislative framework in UK is solid and sufficient. And I do agree with that. But key question here is whether or not these laws are enforced properly in practice. And I'll let you be the judge of that. When I argue that there are some problems, then I'll tell you the reason why. If you see the figures there, in between 2011 and 2012, there were 150 prosecutions in England and Wales. Now that seems like a lot of prosecutions, but I don't think so, given the number of victims being exploited and given the number of traffickers operating in this country. It is better than nothing, but UK government should do more. And out of that, in 2011, it's only 8 convictions. So the vast majority of the traffickers went free. I think there's something wrong in that scenario. It's only 8 convictions. In relation to slavery and forced labor, between 2010 and 2012, again, it's only 15 prosecutions, despite the fact that the thousands of people are exploited every day in this country, all over the UK, and I just find that quite shocking, only 15 prosecutions. And finally, the average sentence is 5 years, despite the fact that the legislation provides for the maximum of 14. 5 years, that means traffickers get out of jail in about 2 years, or even less. Given the amount of money that they can make, do you think they care about spending a couple of years in prison? No, they don't care. So again, there's something wrong. If it's 14, why are they getting out of jail in 2 years? So, are these laws properly enforced in practice? Perhaps you can answer that. Protection of victims, then. It is important to acknowledge that some improvements have been made compared to the past. So, for example, the UK now has this national referral mechanism. This is a mechanism by which victims are identified. So-called first responders, such as the police and social services and local authorities or other non-governmental organizations, once they identify possible victims of trafficking, they'll refer them through these mechanisms, whereby there's 2 competent authorities, UK Border Agency and UK Human Trafficking Centre, then are going to decide whether or not a particular individual indeed is trafficked. And once a positive decision is made, and then a reflection period of 45 days is given. Now that is a period of time where victims can recover from their ordeals. And if victims are willing to cooperate with the police and prosecution, the government will give them a renewable residence permit of 1 year so that they can participate in the criminal justice system. And in the meantime, the government also provides things such as safe houses, subsistence, medical and psychological assistance. What normally happens is that they'll give funding to local organizations, human rights organizations, women's shelter, children's charity, and so on, so that they can, in turn, provide appropriate assistance because they are experts in these areas. So that's what happens. So, as I said, some improvements have been made compared to the past. But there are a number of problems once again. For example, I have consistently argued that the reflection period is not long enough, 45 days. Imagine that you are a victim of rape or grievous bodily harm or other serious crimes. Do you think a little over a month will give you enough time to recover? Just imagine these victims in sexual exploitation. They are forced to have sex with 10, 15 men every day for 2-3 years. Is it reasonable to expect them to recover from their ordeals within 45 days? Well, in a country such as Italy, they provide an automatic right to stay for 3 months. And funny enough, when I was advising the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights, we have argued that the UK should do the same. But again, they haven't listened. Another problem here is there's no clear statutory basis, so everything's given on a discretionary basis. A problem with that is if they choose not to do so, they don't have to. And the accountability is an issue. We cannot hold them accountable for not protecting victims. That is a problem. And the third point, cooperation with the authorities is essential. So if they choose not to cooperate because they are too traumatized, their response, bye-bye, get out of here, go back to your own country. That happens. So they are not able to benefit from these measures. And finally, compensation are quite rare. My colleague Saki within School of Law might agree with me on this, and it's quite extremely difficult to seek compensation because once they return to their home, how could you seek compensation from the UK? Language barrier, they don't have access to lawyers, interpreters, and so on. It is almost impossible to seek compensation. Once again, they are victims of crimes and they should be entitled to this measure, but that doesn't happen in many cases. Again, there is a problem with that. Now, in relation to third obligation, prevention. Now, UK government has, or Parliament has enacted a couple legislation to curb the demand. For example, in relation to demand for sexual exploitation, there is Policing and Crime Act 2009, which punishes clients who purchase sexual services from trafficked victims with a fine of £1,000. Now, there are a few key issues in this regime. First is the knowledge on the part of clients. Now, this is so-called a strict liability offense where we do not have to prove the knowledge on the part of clients. So, even if they do not know the fact that the other person is trafficked, you can still be fined. The first question there is fairness. If they do not know that the other person is trafficked, should you go to jail? Not jail, but should you be fined for it? Many people say, well, that's not fair, but from the government's point of view, then it is. Why? Because if you see a foreign prostitute working, that has to ring a bell. There is no way that UK government would issue a visa to foreign nationals to be here and work as a prostitute. So that is a message that government is trying to send. So I think this is, and if it works well, then that's a good measure. But the second point I wanted to raise then is fine. These men are quite wealthy. That's why they go and see prostitutes. So whether or not £1,000 a fine is effective, I don't know. Some people may say yes, but many people say, no, that's not good enough, if you can pay them off. So the question is, should we be instituting other measures such as imprisonment? In Finland, for example, these clients can go to jail up to 6 months. Should we not institute a similar measure, or is that too much? Or what about naming and shaming in local and national newspapers? And that'll grab the headline, surely, like perverts or something like that in a headline. And these men are more afraid of being discovered by their wives and girlfriends than being fined anyway. So that may act as a strong deterrence for them not to engage in sexual activities. But then again, there is an issue of human rights. Is it right to publish their names? And many people have an issue with that. And finally, there's a statutory limitation of 6 months. So that means after 6 months, if the one is not prosecuted or punished, they go free. Now, this doesn't happen to most of serious crimes in this country, but this is a summary offense, and therefore after 6 months, they will go free. And there's a problem here is because investigation into human trafficking and so on takes a huge amount of time. So that is a reality of it. Many clients may go free anyway, and that is a problem there. In terms of demand for labor exploitation, there is, once again, legislation, Immigration, Asylum, and Nationality Act 2006, which provides for 10,000 fine per illegal migrant hired and or 2 years imprisonment. What do you think of that? Do you think this is effective? 10,000 fines sounds like a lot of money. But again, given the amount of profit that they can make, surely many of these employers are able to pay them off. An added difficulty is that it is, again, unrealistic to expect the police to knock on every single business and every single restaurant and takeaway joint in this country. Simply, they do not have resources for that. So oftentimes, they go undiscovered. 2 years, once again, if you're a first-time offender, you probably get suspended sentence. Even if you do get custodial sentence, you get out of jail in about a year or less. Is that effective? Now, in terms of education and of the general public, the government has instituted a campaign known as Blue Blindfold campaign a while ago. There was an awareness-raising campaign, and again, putting information and on billboards, posters at bus stops, train stations, and other outlets, and also advertising through media such as national, regional newspapers, and radio and internet. Now, out of curiosity, how many of you have actually seen this campaign or heard about this? Would you raise your hand if you do? 2, 3 people or 4 in this room. That actually proves my point. If it's probably about close to 50, 60 members here now, audience here, and it's only a few. So this campaign was regarded as not effective because it did fail to reach out to people who are likely to exploit these victims or be in contact with them. So and the result of that is that the demand remains quite strong. These people continue to be exploited. So I want to come back to this question of what can we do as the members of the general public. Now, again, I've given you a kind of grim picture, but there's no need to be overtly pessimistic because there are things that we can do to alleviate this problem. And I wanted to share some of these things with you so that perhaps you can think about this further. First and foremost, don't purchase sexual services. It's simple enough, but I think this is wrong, particularly if you see foreign women, chances are that they are trafficked, and it is wrong to still go ahead engage in sexual exploitation. This actually is far deeper than this. We need to educate all these men and boys and tackle this lads and macho culture from the beginning so that everyone can be appreciative of the status of women and human rights of women so that they do respect their human rights. And I think that is quite important. This commodification of female sexuality and body has become such an important and a serious problem, not just in this country, but elsewhere. And we need to tackle that head on, I think. Second, pay attention to products and goods which are quite cheap. Now, under this economic climate, we do all appreciate all these cheap goods and services. There's no question about that. But instead of accepting it as they are, it would be nice if you can start questioning some of these. It is not that difficult nowadays to do a bit of research on Google and go to their company websites. and so on. And if you discover that they are engaging in unethical behavior, then surely you can do the consumer boycott, particularly nowadays through the social network sites such as Facebook, which does not cost you that much money. Now, this has become such a powerful weapon in recent times. We have seen that in a case of Starbucks. Do you remember that? Now, Starbucks, among other companies, was implicated for not paying enough tax in this country, right? So there's a tax avoidance scheme. There was a public outrage. So there were demonstrations, consumer boycott, and look what happened. They backed down, and they promised to pay tax, more tax from now on. They are very sensitive to consumer demands. Why? Because they care about their public image, which is directly linked to profits, right? So they will listen to you. So the point here is that please do not underestimate the power of your voice, because you can make a difference. The next point, fair trade products. Now, as you might know, these fair trade products will try to guarantee fair working conditions in producer countries. Many of them are quite poor in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and so on. So these farmers are getting paid a fair amount of wages for what they do, or they have a better working conditions, social security, and so on. And now I'd like to commend the Keio University for taking a proactive stance on this. And as I understand it, this is a fully accredited fair trade university. And I think that's quite important. So whatever you see, many things that you purchase here are actually fair trade products. Now, these things may cost a little bit more than normal coffee in other places, but you can purchase them knowing that you are actually promoting and protecting the human rights of these farmers in different parts of the world. But I think that this fair trade movement should go further than educational institution, and it should again spread to every single town. And I would like to see more products, fair trade products, in the shops that you go locally and so on. So there is a long way, I think, to go. And next point, report the suspected cases of human trafficking. Now, if you see Chinese nationals picking cocos in the sea, there is something, once again, wrong in the picture. And instead of not doing anything, please do report these kind of suspected cases so that the authorities can take appropriate investigation and action, so that these people can be rescued from forced labor and slavery. The next point, get involved in local and national organizations dealing with this issue. Now, there are so many human rights and other organizations dealing with human trafficking one way or another, and you can help out by volunteering your time, couple hours a week, just helping out these organizations. And you can even educate the general public by participating and actively involved in these endeavors. And finally, lobby your politicians at local and national levels so that they can take appropriate measures at different levels. So I think there are certain things that we can do as members of the general public, and I hope that you are able to think about these issues further and trying to do something about it. So to conclude my lecture this evening, human trafficking is clearly regarded as an issue of international concern. That is the reason why the United Nations has adopted a particular treaty on this issue. The relevant branches of international law, particularly transnational criminal law and human rights law, impose 3 P obligations to promote effective action against this practice. Third point, the UK has taken some steps to implement these obligations, although it is also clear that more needs to be done. And finally, trafficking must be tackled through a joint effort of the government and the general public, because we, as I said, may be facilitating this crime one way or another. So it is important that we can all work together to tackle this problem. Well, thank you very much for your attention. And again, well, thank you very much for coming. And that concludes my lecture this evening. Thanks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, as always on these occasions, it's my very pleasant duty to offer the vote of thanks to our lecturer this evening. I think what we've just heard is an extremely good illustration of what an inaugural lecture should be. It's a lecture that comes from deep scholarship and awareness of a specialist subject area, but it's a lecture that, while demonstrating that deep knowledge and awareness, doesn't overwhelm us with too much detail, too much technicality, gives a really very strong picture of what the strengths and weaknesses are of the area in question. A very sobering picture, I think, of the position, the sort of disjuncture between the theory and the practice, the law and the reality on the ground. Some of those figures I found, really quite horrifying, and I'm sure you did. But one of the key things that shone through this lecture for me was the point that Tom made about the importance of education, the education campaigns that have been carried out, perhaps not very successfully to date, by government in order to make sure that the legislative framework is perhaps better implemented. But what better illustration could we have had of the importance of education than a splendid lecture such as this, reinforcing to a very diverse audience the importance of engagement by everybody, legislators and non-legislators alike, in tackling what is clearly a persistent and horrendous problem. So I'm sure you will want to join me in thanking Tom for his excellent lecture. But before we do that in the normal way, I wonder if I could invite the Vice-Chancellor to come and present Tom with a memento of this evening's occasion.